All right, last week I may have ventured too far into the weeds, but in my defense, Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 6 is one of the most debated and eschatologically significant texts in the entire book. So I took pains to try to explain why I see it the way I do, and I may have gone overboard. But today I'm going to try to fly a bit higher over the text. Now, in Revelation chapter 19, we see Christ's role in God's vanquishing of the forces that gathered to make war on him by attacking the church. And Jesus returns and treads the winepress of the fury of God's wrath. And at chapter 20, we once again back up. Okay, this time to magnify or put the spotlight on God's dealing with Satan prior to that final battle portrayed in chapter 19. And the first 3 verses of chapter 20, Satan is prohibited from prematurely gathering the nations for the final assault, from gathering them before the time of God's choosing. And since the performance of miracles will play a key role in his deceiving of the nations into gathering against God, that is a key part of how he is going to get allegiance and loyalty, and this idea that he is divine. Miracles play a key role in that. I suggested to you that the way Satan is prohibited from prematurely gathering the nations for that final assault is that he is deprived of any ability to perform nation-gathering miracles. Whatever type of miracle that may be that is adequate for that purpose of gathering the nations for that final assault, he is deprived of that power. Only in the fullness of God's time, which is symbolized by that 1,000 years, 10 cubed, will he be set free to deceive the nations in that way. Then in verse 4 of chapter 20, John sees the souls of those who died for their faith during this time of Satan's restriction, prior to Antichrist's appearance. So this is during the time of his chaining, his restriction, when he's being deprived of this ability to organize, to gather the nation. So prior to the time of Antichrist, he sees those souls sitting on thrones and reigning in heaven with Christ. This is a different perspective on and a different presentation of the souls of the martyrs that we saw in chapter 6, verse 9. As I said, I think these martyrs, as quintessential overcomers, they represent all overcomers, meaning they represent all Christians who maintained their faith in the face of pressures to abandon it. So they're as martyrs, they're the quintessential overcomers. But in that, I think they represent all faithful Christians, all overcomers. And the message is that the souls of those who die in Christ in the age prior to the Great Tribulation, meaning those who die having maintained their loyalty to Jesus as represented by the martyrs, they will enjoy blessed intimacy with Christ and honor in heaven as they await the literal resurrection. Just as the faithful of the final generation, those who in the vision we've been given died under Antichrist, just as they are shown experiencing a blessed heavenly existence, as we see in chapter 7, 9 to 14, 14, 1 to 5, chapter 19, 1 to 3. So all the faithful prior to that generation, they will also experience that blessing. So as I said repeatedly throughout the series, the faithful of the final generation, the blessings that were given to the faithful of the final generation, that implied blessing of the faithful of all prior generations, because the faithful of the final generation were expressing the faith they held in common with prior generations. They are cuts from the same cloth, just taken at different times. And here I think that implication is made clear, that those of the prior generation share in that blessedness. This is what the voice from heaven declared in chapter 14, verse 13, where John was told, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Truly, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their works follow after them." And as I mentioned, when we were on that verse, that recalling that from now on may not be the correct reading of that, right? You have many times where people say, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on," and I explain why that may not be the right way of reading it. And so if you see it that way, John simply says, "Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Truly, says the Spirit, that they may rest from the labors, for their works follow after them." And I think that's what we are seeing here. And as I said, we here get a different perspective on and presentation of the martyrs throughout history, those souls that were depicted in chapter 6, verses 9 to 11, as being under the heavenly altar. There, the depiction of them that symbolizes that their lives were poured out in sacrifice to God. Right? Remember, Paul says when he's ready to depart, and he says, "I'm already being poured out as a drink offering," giving up his life in service of Christ. As you would have these things in a conjunction with certain sacrifices, a drink offering poured out at the foot of the altar. Well, that's what's being symbolized of the souls of the martyrs in chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. And here we get a different perspective, and that it's a different perspective on that same group. It's indicated by the fact that in both of the places, in chapter 6 and in here, you have disembodied souls of people who had been killed for the Word of God and the testimony about Christ, and who are living in the divine presence in heaven. So you see those parallels. So I think we're seeing just a different perspective on the same group. Here, however, the emphasis is on the blessing of their condition. You're right? It's on the blessing of their condition, their intimacy and exaltation with Christ in heaven, rather than on their cry. In chapter 6, the focus was on their cry for final vindication, the vindication of their faith through the final judgment. Same group, I just think being presented in a different way. Now, Paul had the blessing of this intermediate state in mind when he said in Philippians chapter 1, verse 23, that his desire was to depart and be with Christ, for that's far better. Well, what is the intermediate state going to be like as I'm disembodied for that period of time, awaiting the resurrection, the physical resurrection? What's going to be great? It's going to be blessed. And it's being portrayed. It's going to be this intimacy and honor in heaven as being depicted by these souls on thrones. Paul also, that's the same idea behind Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, that they would rather be away from the body and be at home with the Lord. Right? Not something to be feared, but moving a passage into a glorious, blessed state. And the blessing of the Christian's existence in the intermediate state, the time before their physical resurrection, awaiting that resurrection, it's here portrayed as the souls sitting on thrones and judgment having been given either to them or for them. And that is an indication, right, of divine favor. Sitting on thrones, judgment having been given to or for them, and even now, before the consummation, they're given the privilege, before the finalization, before the eternal state, even now they're given this privilege of sharing in some way in Christ's rule. And you see that as Gregory Beale says in his commentary. Beale says, when saints are translated to heaven at death, They join Christ on his judicial throne to rule over the enemy in inaugurated fulfillment of the promise given to overcomers in chapter 3:21 and chapter 2:26 and 27, though these promises will reach complete fulfillment at the final resurrection of the saints. 3:21, to the one overcoming I will give to him to sit with me on my throne as I overcame and sat with my Father on his throne. So likewise, Matthew 19:28, Luke 22:30. They actually carry out their reign with Christ probably, now he's speculating here, probably by agreeing with and praising his judicial decisions, and their witness becomes a basis for Christ's judgment of the ungodly at the end of the age. See on 19:14. Consequently, the saints are pictured as beginning to reign and to execute the judicial function that they will carry out consummatively at the end of the ages in fulfillment of Daniel 7:22. Now in verse 4, if verse 4 means, like I said, it can mean either judgment is given to them or judgment is given for them. If it means judgment is given for them, well, it's a way of saying that their blessed state, this blessed state that they have been brought into, that is God's judgment for them, in that it's God's giving them favor. It's an indication of his approval of them because he's brought them into a blessed state. So judgment is given for them in that sense. And then we see that the rest of the dead in verse 5. Now here this means the rest of the dead is referring to non-Christians who die during this period of Satan's restraint. Okay, they do not live, meaning their souls or spirits do not enjoy fellowship with God and intimacy with God during this time, which is life. That's not true in their case. Their lot, the non-Christian's lot in the intermediate state, is the dreadful realm of the rich man in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. You see, they will not live. So the saints who die, they go to be united with God in heaven into this glorious spiritual existence. They live, being with God, that is life. But the non-Christians who die do not have that. They go instead to that dreadful realm portrayed in Luke 16. And they will not live until the end of all things, until the general resurrection. Okay, till after the 1,000 years are over, Satan is released and we have Christ's return and the judgment. We have the general resurrection, the bodily resurrection of all people. Well, they won't live until the end of all things, until this bodily resurrection. And they will at that time, with all others, be raised to life bodily. Now, in their case, they're raised to life bodily, only to be thrown into the lake of fire. Now we see in verses 11 to 15, which is the second death. Now, if you're following me, you say, well, if you're taking that understanding of it, well, that makes live in verse 4 and live in verse 5 mean two different things, right? It's the same word, and so you've got to. So is that legit? Can you do that? Yeah, you can do that. You see, you can do that. Because that kind of switch is possible, right? Because here they lived and reigned, and by living, I'm saying they lived spiritually in that they went from here into this union with God in heaven and that intimate fellowship which is life. So a figurative kind of spiritual blessing there, this figurative living. And here you're saying the rest of that do not live, and there you're using live as a bodily resurrection, so you're really using live in two different ways. And so the question is that okay, can you do that? And I say, yes, you can, because just to take one example, you can switch this way, particularly in literature like this, apocalyptic literature. But Jesus said in Matthew 8:22 and Luke 9:60, let the dead bury their own dead. So just in a few words, he's switching. Let the spiritually dead, those who are not united with God, bury the physically dead. Okay, so that's not a defeater for the argument. That people say, well, you can't do that because you're switching the meanings of live. Yes, I am switching the meaning of live, but I think that's legit. Okay, and I think that is what's being said. And also, sometimes people say, well, you can't have these resurrections be different that way. You can't be talking about this living. You're talking about the saints that die, who then their souls go to be with God in heaven. You're calling that a living, and that's a first resurrection. And they say you can't have that be called resurrection, and then the bodily resurrection be called a resurrection, because he calls this one the first resurrection. So the claim is, look, if you're going to call something the first, well then the second, these two things have to be identical. The only difference between them, if you're going to label one the first and the other one the second, the only difference is their order or sequence. They are identical things that are simply distinguished by their order. Well, is that true? Every time I label something first and second, is it true that it must be the same in nature? No. That's not true at all, right? For example, the first heaven and the first earth. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, they are different in nature and kind from the new heavens and the new earth that follow them, right? They are fallen. The new heavens and new earth that follow them are not. So labeling something, it does not mean. Labeling things first and second need not mean that the only difference between them is their order of appearance. Okay, so I alert you to that idea. All right, so there is maybe this will be useful to you. Right, there is the first death. You see here, death in a literal sense, and that involves all people except those who are here when Jesus returns. Right, nothing certain but death and taxes. Everybody's going to die. All people are going to experience that. So there's the first death, which is dying physically, which is a separation of soul or body, the non-material element or aspect of a human, from the body. That is what death is. It is the separation of soul or spirit from the body. So you have this first is dying physically, and for the saints, and that obviously that's for the saved and the lost. And for the saints, that first death is followed by a new kind of spiritual life with God, in that their soul or body goes to the thrones and is that intimate relationship in heaven with God. So it's followed by a new kind of spiritual life with God. So it is a figurative resurrection, right? It is a move from death to that distinctive spiritual life. This figurative resurrection that is limited to the saints, because the rest of the dead don't experience that, right? It's limited to the saints. It's called the first resurrection because it will be followed by a second literal resurrection, a bodily resurrection in which all the dead will join. All right? So the first death, saved and lost. Everybody's dying. The first resurrection is the saved alone, those spirits that go up. And the second resurrection involves everybody. It is a literal bodily resurrection. It is the general resurrection of the dead. Now, for the lost, that second resurrection is followed, as I say, by being cast into the lake of fire. That is an eternal punishment. This is the second death in which the bodily resurrected saints, they have no part in the second death. Why? Because they're not condemned. The lake of fire is eternal condemnation. So they have no part. So death is death in a figurative sense, separation of the person from God eternally. All right, and that's the lost alone. So you see, first death, saved and lost. First resurrection, or first death, literal, saved and lost. First resurrection, you have it figurative, saved alone. Second resurrection, literal, saved and lost. Second death, figurative, lost alone. I think that's the way it works. Okay, so that's what I hope that'll be of some use to you. Now, the passage of the righteous from death to the spiritual blessings of the intermediate state is nowhere else called a resurrection. Okay? Nowhere else do you see this idea that the souls of the martyrs representing all the faithful, that when they die, their passage to be in the heavenly realm in the intermediate state is nowhere else called a resurrection. And that's not surprising given what resurrection means. Right? The literal meaning of resurrection is restoration of bodily life. That's inherent in the word. Okay, so that is what provides the figurative meaning. The literal meaning is it involves bodily life. But such figurative usage, so that's what it means, bodily life. But you say, okay, well, he's referring to it, he's using it figuratively to refer to the souls or spirit going to be in the heavenly realm with God after death, the souls or spirits of the righteous. But a figurative use isn't out of the question in an apocalyptic book like Revelation, especially given the fact that John signals that something different's going on by adding the adjective first. Right? He lets you know, I'm using this is different. This is the first resurrection. So he's letting you know that there's something different about how he's using resurrection. And even N.T. Wright, who thinks that such a figurative use of resurrection is unlikely, even he acknowledges that it is, quote, possible with the kind of imagery we find in Revelation. Yes, I think it's possible, and I think it's right. I think that's what he's referring to as the first resurrection. Now, it's figurative, I get that. I know what resurrection is. Resurrection's bodies. But here when he says the first resurrection, and he's talking about the souls there beheaded, the souls in heaven, he's using it figuratively for this separation. Death is the separation of soul and spirit from the body, and the first resurrection for the saints is this ascension to the heavenly realm as we await the literal resurrection, the intermediate state. All right, chapter 20, verse 7 to 10. Modified slightly, I'll tell you where. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city. That's one of the alterations I made. I took this clause here to be explanatory. In other words, it's another case of an epexegetical chi that I talked about last week, okay, in my judgment. So that's why, because the ESV says, surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. No, I think the beloved city is the camp of the saints. Okay, so surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where also the beast and the false prophet are thrown. I put that in there. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Okay, so in God's time, right, in this 1,000 years, 10 cubed, the completeness of God's time, Satan is released. And in my understanding, that means that Satan is empowered at that time to perform nation-gathering miracles. And he promptly exercises that power to gather the nations for battle against God. This is the same battle referred to in Revelation chapter 19, verse 19, what in chapter 16, verses 14 to 16, is called the battle at Armageddon on the great day of God the Almighty. Now, that it is the same battle, that's clear to me from the fact that both Revelation chapter 20, verse 8, and chapter 19, verses 17 and 18, they refer to the battle against Gog in Ezekiel chapter 39, verses 17 to 20. So I have in 19 and 20, I have this battle, and in both places you refer to the battle against Gog from Ezekiel 38. If they're distinctive events, why is he tying them together by referring to the same text in Ezekiel? He's saying to me that it's the same battle. Here's what R. Fowler White says. He says, if we are expected to interpret the revolts in Revelation 19 and 20 as different episodes in history, we would hardly expect John to describe them in language and imagery derived from the same episode in Ezekiel's prophecy. Right, so that's reinforcing for me that we have stepped back. This is not something that's separated from 19. We've stepped back and we're looking at the same battle in a different perspective. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, Gog refers to the leader from the land of Magog. Okay? The leader from the land of Magog, the leader of a distant and fierce people who, in great alliance with people from all over the world, attacks Israel, the people of God. And John, the inspired apostle John, he sees the fulfillment of that prophecy in the hostile nations that are drawn together by Satan into attacking the church, Gog and Magog. They were frequently interpreted in Jewish circles, in rabbinic circles, to refer symbolically to the nations of Psalm 2 that are in rebellion against God and His Messiah, and that will be destroyed in the eschatological battle. Okay, so that's not an odd thing. So John, he sees the fulfillment of that as an end-time eschatological fulfillment here with Satan gathering the nations. Just as we have Gog from the land of Magog and attacking the nation of Israel, the people of God, he sees the fulfillment in the ultimate end, the eschatological time when Satan gathers the nations to attack the church. And he sees it being fulfilled there. Now the enemies of God, they march against His people who are called the camp of the saints, and they're equated with the beloved city, as I see it, okay? Where he says they're surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city, the church. You say, well, why do you think they're equated? Why do you think he calls the camp of the saints the beloved city? Well, the church is referred to as the holy city in chapter 11, verse 2. And in chapter 3, verse 12, Jesus says that He will write on the faithful the name of His God and the name of the city of His God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from God out of heaven, and His own new name. Now, as the church is under siege by God's enemies, the judgment of God described as fire from heaven that comes, right? As it's under siege, that judgment comes. That fire from heaven. You recall that the breaking of the seventh seal in chapter 8, verse 1, which made available the revelation of the scroll. You remember it's sealed with 7 seals and you don't get the contents of the scroll until you break the final seal? Well, you remember the breaking of that 7th and final seal in chapter 8, verse 1, which made available the revelation. It's followed by, in chapter 8, verse 5, the angel hurling fire onto earth. The angel throwing the fire down, and this symbol of divine judgment that we see as the seal is now ready to be seen. What do we see? Judgment comes. And the symbol of divine judgment, it then gets developed and expanded as the contents of the scroll, now accessible with the breaking of the 7th seal, as the contents of the scroll are revealed. And if you've been with me, you see judgment coming back and giving different perspectives on the vindication of God's people against the assault on them. Now, Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, it says, "And the devil that deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur." Then it simply says, "where also the beast and the false prophet." That's it. Where also the beast and the false prophet. And it continues, "and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Now notice that it does not say it does not say that the beast and the false prophet were thrown into the lake long before Satan. Right? So you have people say, no. This is chapter 19, and we have this long thing that we have over here. There's this big, long gap over here. You see, because the beast and the false prophet, they were thrown in long before, and then much later, after this other stuff and this other battle, we get Satan being thrown in. It doesn't say that. Right? It doesn't say that at all. In fact, it says nothing about the timing of those events, about the throwing into the lake of fire of the beast and false prophet and Satan. You could supply, as I say, it simply says, where also the beast, and you Greek scholars can check me on that, where also the beast and false prophet. So you could as easily insert "are thrown" as many translations had been thrown. Okay, you could as easily put that there, and even if the text indicated that the beast and false prophet were thrown into the lake of fire before Satan, it could mean that they were thrown in at generally the same time, but right before Satan. Right, at the same time here, or it could simply mean that they were thrown in first in the vision, that it was revealed in the vision that they were thrown in first. So the idea that you can pull from this to say, no, this shows that there's some big break between the beast and false prophet being cast into the lake of fire and Satan, I just think that's a mistake. I don't think that's the way to read it, and I don't think it can be demonstrated. Sam Storms, in one of his articles, he's written a book about amillennialism, but here, this is from an online article. He says, so when were the beast and false prophet cast in? The answer would appear to be at the conclusion of the war when the devil himself was cast in. That's what I think. I think we got one big battle. He brings it. He comes. They get defeated. They all get chucked in. Okay, he goes on, he says, the three jointly instigated the Armageddon Gog-Magog revolt and are therefore jointly cast into the lake of fire to be jointly tormented forever and ever. The text does not say that the beast and false prophet were already in the lake of fire when Satan was cast in. Even if it did, this need only imply that after the war, the beast and false prophet were first judged and thrown into the lake of fire, a judgment and fate then immediately applied to Satan. You see, so you couldn't read into that some big, long split. And then I say, even if you say, well, they are thrown in first, you say, well, that could simply be talking about that it was revealed first. In other words, an artifact of the vision as it was presented. As Storms goes on, he says, all that we may legitimately conclude is that the vision given to John of the beast and false prophet being cast into the lake of fire precedes, in other words, the vision of their being cast in precedes the vision given to him of Satan being cast in. The order of revelation is shown first beast and false prophet, then shown Satan. He says, in order to prove the historical antecedents of the former to the latter, far more is needed than what the text itself supplies. I think that's right. He says it's just as likely, if not more so, that what we have here is simply the literary antecedents of one vision to another, not the historical sequence of their respective contents. Okay, so I don't know how tuned in you are to some of these questions. Some of the things I'm saying, if you haven't played around with this and you don't even know what I'm talking about, well, hang on and I'll be on another subject in a minute. Amen. Okay? So, but if you're tuned in, then you hear what I'm saying about premillennialism, and I'm going to say more about that. In fact, I'm going to say more about that right now. Now, as I have explained, I am with most people in churches of Christ. I don't know of any head counting, and since we are autonomous congregations, it's difficult to get a feel for such a thing. But at least historically, in churches of Christ, what we typically would be what is described as millennials or millennialists, okay? Or what I think is more properly, more accurately called realized millennialists, okay? It's not that we deny the millennium. We just think it's ongoing, it's present, okay? It is a figurative millennium that is happening. But here's a visual depiction of millennialism that I pulled off the internet, and I think it's reasonable. Okay, so you see here, right? We just have here, we have Christ, and we have this church at this time period, God's time, when he's going to bring all things to a close. So this is a time of Satan's chaining, his restriction, when he is prohibited, in my view, of being able to perform nation-gathering miracles. He's cut loose. He goes out, deceives the nations. We have Armageddon, the great battle against the church. Christ returns, treads the winepress of the fury of God's wrath. We have the resurrection and the judgment. Okay? And then we have the eternal state, the new heavens and new earth. Okay? That's how I think eschatology plays out. It's complicated. You can make arguments for all kinds of things, but I'm saying that's how I think, that's where I think the truth lies. Okay? Obviously, since you have different eschatological schemes, there are people who disagree with that. Okay, but that's what I think is right. Now, I want to say something about some of the problems that I have. I've mentioned some of these along the way, but let me just say a word about some additional problems I have with what is known as premillennialism. Okay, I'm not turning this into an eschatology class. I'm teaching Revelation. But on this, let me just say a bit. Like, consider this like an extended footnote, okay? There are different flavors of premillennialism. All right, they're not all the same. You have traditional, or what is also known as historical premillennialism. You have this more complicated dispensational variety, what is known as dispensational premillennialism. That's represented in the series of books, the Left Behind series, that was written some years ago by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, got a lot of play. And there are what is known as progressive premillennialists. Now, I don't want to take time to explore these in any detail. It's a good thing I don't want to take time, because I really don't have time. But for our present purposes, okay, just know that all of the flavors, I just give you two here. I give you the dispensational premillennialism and historic premillennialism. Just know that all of the flavors of premillennialism, they have Christ returning to the earth at the time of Antichrist and defeating him at Armageddon, then binding Satan. Okay, so it's not that he's been bound, he's released, we have Armageddon, and Christ comes. No. He returns, defeats Satan there at Armageddon, then he binds Satan, and then establishes a literal earthly kingdom for 1,000 years, or some would say, well, the 1,000 years simply symbolizes an earthly kingdom of a long period of time. Okay. But you have this idea of he establishes a literal earthly kingdom of 1,000 years, and at the end of the 1,000 years, then Satan is released. He gathers the unconverted to attack Christ at his earthly headquarters, and then he's defeated in the Gog-Magog battle, which is something different from Armageddon, and he's then thrown into the lake of fire. Okay, so that's something that is consistent across them. And all of the premillennialist views, they have the resurrection of the righteous, the just, the saved, occurring before Christ's 1,000-year earthly reign, and the resurrection of the wicked, the unsaved, the unjust, occurring after the 1,000-year earthly reign, after Christ defeats the recently released Satan. So that's when they have that resurrection. So they also have the final judgment and the assignment of all persons to their eternal dwelling places occurring after the 1,000-year reign, after the defeat of, in their view, the recently released Christ. All right. Now, in my mind, see how much of this I can get through, but in my mind, the splitting of the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the wicked, splitting that apart like that, and this splitting of the final judgment from the second coming of Christ is not justified in the Bible. Okay? Now, obviously people think it is. If people didn't think it is, I wouldn't be talking about this. But I just am not persuaded. I think that's wrong. All right, well, they would tell me, you're wrong. Okay. I play in this world. I know how that works. But that's why I think, the final judgment, it's tied to Christ's second coming. That final judgment is tied to that second coming in a number of texts, like 2 Thessalonians 1, 7-10. You can also look at Revelation 22:12, Matthew 16:27, Matthew 25, 31-46, Jude verses 14 and 15. It doesn't occur 1,000 years after the coming. It's tied to the second coming. Indeed, Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 4-13, he links the beginning of the final state, the creation of the new heavens and new earth. He links that to Christ's return. And you can also see that in Romans chapter 8, verses 19-23. Now, if the final state occurs in conjunction with Christ's return, there's no room for an earthly reign of 1,000 years after that return, right? Because the final state is the final eternal state. So there's no room for that. And then the scriptures also teach that there's one bodily resurrection of believers and unbelievers, right? In the parable of the wheat and weeds, in Matthew 13:24-30, as explained in verses 36-43, the sons of the kingdom and the sons of the evil one, they are harvested at the same time. Paul says in Acts chapter 24, verse 15, that there is a resurrection, singular. There is a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And Jesus specified in John 5:28 and 29 that the resurrection of both believers and unbelievers would occur at the same hour, not 1,000 years apart. Okay, I'll finish up with this here. Like I said, I'm just saying just a bit about this, just to let you know. I didn't want to just say, I'm an amillennialist and leave it. I want to say I'm an amillennialist, and here's some of the things that rub me about the premillennialist view. If I thought premillennialism was the truth, I'd tell you. I don't think it's the truth. Okay? I think the amillennial view is what the Bible reveals. Okay? Not next week, in 2 weeks, so you'll have to get caught back up. See, who knows how much I'll say about this again. But thanks for coming.